Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Pandemic Parenting Exchange webinar. And my name is Victoria Bruick, and I'm the digital content producer with Pandemic Parenting. We are really excited for our guests, panelists, and our moderator who are joining our Dr. Amanda Zelechoski and Dr. Lindsay Malloy tonight for this conversation on grief. A few tech reminders before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions that you would like our panelists to discuss if we have time for them at the end of the webinar using our Q&A function. This is in your Zoom toolbar, and Gideon, our moderator, will be able to take a look at those and kind of, you guys can also upvote different questions that you would like them to answer with the time that we have allotted. I'll be posting links to some of the resources that our panelists will be talking about in the chat function. We'll also be providing a recording of this webinar as well as a whole list of these resources and more on our website in a few days. So if you don't get all the links tonight, they'll be available soon. That's all I have for now. And so I'd like to get started and introduce Dr. Amanda Zelechoski. She is a clinical and forensic psychologist and an associate professor of psychology at Valparaiso University. Dr. Lindsay Malloy is a developmental and forensic psychologist and an associate professor at Ontario Tech University. You can read more about them and their backgrounds on our website. With that, I'll leave it with you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And thanks everybody for being here to join us tonight for what I think is going to be a really interesting and helpful conversation. So I wanted to just give a little context before we start on the reason we chose this topic and this timing. So August 30th was National Grief Awareness Day. And so we decided that both the combination of that and the timing for me personally was just a really great opportunity for us to tackle this topic. So just about a year ago, I lost one of my dearest and longest friends in the entire world, Mariana Baserga. And what would have been her 40th birthday is coming up next Tuesday, September 8th. And so it just felt really perfect timing and an amazing opportunity for us to talk through grief because it has been such an ever-present part of our pandemic experiences, which we'll be talking about today. And so because this webinar today is in her loving memory, all of the donations that come in, all of the proceeds will go to what we created a year ago in her honor called the Moving Barriers Fund, the Mariana Baserga Moving Barriers Fund, in partnership with El Monte Promise. Mariana was from El Monte, California, her beloved hometown, and was very passionate about education for especially first-generation students and students who might be facing a lot of barriers. And so what the Moving Barriers Fund does is cover SAT, ACT application fees, college application fees, and just tries to really remove a lot of these barriers that are commonly in the way for students who come from underserved backgrounds. So we're really excited to be partnering with them tonight. And as I said, every little bit helps. Last year, they were able to provide scholarships to over 30 students in El Monte to allow them to apply for college and take the SATs and ACT tests to move forward on their journeys. So we thank you very much for your support. The donation information is up on the image now, and I thank you very much for joining us tonight as I also try to honor somebody who is very dear to me and to talk a little bit about our grief journey, which many of us have lost people along this pandemic way or along this pandemic journey. And so I actually wrote about my journey in a blog through the grief of this. And so that link is shared as well, if it is helpful to any of you. We will be talking about tonight how it's very helpful to work through your grief experiences with others. So that's the context for our topic tonight. Now, I want to introduce somebody very special as well. One of the things that Lindsay and I are really excited about every time we get to do one of these webinars is to introduce you to an emerging scholar, early career professional, and tonight we get to introduce you to the newly minted Dr. Gideon Litherland. So Dr. Litherland is a clinical counselor, supervisor, and consultant at Veduta Counseling in Chicago, as well as a clinical lecturer and supervisor at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. He was also one of my very first students at Valparaiso University almost 10 years ago. And so this is just such a privilege for us to get to have him here today, moderating this conversation. So I'll turn it over to you, Gideon. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. This is, given how personal and meaningful, this is such an honor just to be able to moderate. So thanks for having me. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My role is to really help steward and focus some of the conversation tonight. So first and foremost, we'll have some discussion with our panelists and our guest expert, and we'll follow that up to close our time together with some Q&A. So again, feel free to throw any questions, comments, reflections in the Q&A box throughout the conversation tonight. But I have the honor to introduce Dr. Margaret Blaustein. Dr. Margaret Blaustein is the director of the Center for Trauma Training in Needham, Massachusetts, and co-author, along with Christine Kinnenberg, of the highly touted book, Treating Complex Trauma in Children and Adolescents, Fostering Resilience Through Attachment, Self-Regulation, and Competence. Her clinical and consulting work focuses on understanding and treating complex trauma in children, and you can read more about her background on the Pandemic Parenting website as well. So let's jump into it. And let me turn to you, Amanda. What is grief, and why in particular are we talking about it tonight in relation to parents COVID-19?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So grief is basically our natural reaction to a loss. And a lot of times people think, that's limited only to when somebody dies or passes away, right? But it isn't just limited to the loss of loved ones. And I think another really important part of this is that the grief process looks different for all of us. All of us will experience grief at some point in our lives, but some of us experience that in more intense ways than others. So I think when we tend to think of grief, you think of the common things we grieve, right? Of course, the death of a loved one, maybe relationships, loss of income or a job, your health, and maybe lost opportunities, lost aspects of your childhood. So those are typical things we tend to talk about grieving. But right now, we're in a pandemic. And so the world-renowned grief expert, Dr. David Kessler, noted in a recent podcast with Brene Brown, which I think Victoria is going to link to in the chat. It was an excellent podcast. I highly recommend it. He was talking about grief related to the pandemic. And he said, we don't even have enough time to count the losses we're all encountering right now. So I think that's why we really wanted to focus on this topic and to honor and name what many of us might not realize is grief that we're experiencing right now. So just to kind of give us context, I want to talk through a few grief terms that we tend to use in the field of psychology. So normal grief, right? Gradually accepting loss while still kind of managing daily activities. And then that's distinguished from traumatic grief. Okay, which is more of an abrupt or unexpected loss, often in a tragic way, can cause really substantial distress. And so that's different than the typical grief we're experiencing. So then we've got complicated grief. These are feelings of loss that are really debilitating and don't necessarily improve over time. The pain tends to be pretty long lasting and severe, and often the person is not able to recover or really resume aspects of their own life. Oh, great. Thanks, Victoria. She's putting up these terms. And then lastly, you might not have heard this term before, which is collective grief. So this is grief felt by a collective group, a community, a society, a nation, our world, right? And I think it's pretty fair to say that right now we're in the midst of collective grief, a collective trauma experience that's resulting in a collective grief. So grief and growth go hand in hand. Like, it's inevitable, right? That we're going to experience some sort of grief. We're going to probably repeatedly encounter it in our lives. But grief isn't the problem. And I think that's what you're going to hear us come back and emphasize a few times tonight. We shouldn't be afraid of our children experiencing grief. Okay? It's the traumatic or complicated grief that can cause longer term problems. But we have to be allowed to feel the pain of our loss in order to grow from it. And so we're going to talk tonight about how it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful framework to really set us off towards. So, I mean, I want to ask again, and Margaret, invite you into this. I know Lindsay's navigating some tech right now, but what kinds of things are both of you grieving? And what are you really finding that parents or kiddos or families are grieving right now?
Yeah, I feel like I loved how you spoke about these sort of different layers of grief, and that statement that there's so much that we can't even count the losses yet. I think we've been really, lucky in some ways in my family because we haven't encountered some of the huge losses that people have had where they've lost loved ones and haven't been able to come together and have the rituals to be together and share that experience. But there are so many small moments, right? And the things that sort of keep layering. And so, I was thinking before this webinar tonight of like, they even keep showing up. So few days ago, we were cleaning up, finally, the bag of junk that was sent home from my daughter's school at the end of the year. You know, when the teachers packed up the desks and sent everything home in big trash bags for the kids, because we never got to go back and go back into the building. And aware, she started crying because she pulled her recorder out of her bag. And I was like, what's wrong? Why are you crying about your recorder? And she said, I never got to do the recorder march. I don't know what you're talking about. And in third grade, apparently the kids all learn the recorder for the first time. And at the end of the year, the third graders get to march through the halls of the elementary school. And it's a third grade only thing that because she didn't complete third grade, she didn't get to do. And so it's those little moments. But I also think there's these intangibles, right? Like I speak to a lot of adults who talk about these parts of ourselves that we feel like we're losing, like feeling competent and feeling like you can do things without having to work too hard. Like there's all these little parts of our sense of identity that I think we've lost in some ways or had moments of loss of connection to.
Lindsay, how about for you? What does grief look like recently?
Yeah, sorry, my sound cut out for a minute. So for me, time with family really has been the big thing. My immediate family is all spread across Canada, the US, England, and Ukraine. And the world was kind of, becoming increasingly global. It seemed like it was getting smaller and easier to, move around. And now we're in this position where, there's all these border restrictions, and I really don't know when my kids are going to see their grandparents again or when they're going to see their aunts or uncles again. We don't have any family in Canada, so it's just something that's really hard pill to swallow to think about. They're so young and they're changing so much. I didn't expect to get shaky, sorry. I've also lost I'm a planner, so just being able to think about what we're going to do next summer, or, we don't even know what we're going to do, what next month is going to be like. So thinking about a year ahead, having that kind of future orientation and planning and or really not having it, losing that has been really hard for me to cope with. In our study, we've been doing this longitudinal study on kids and families and how they're adjusting to the pandemic. And there's something we measured called intolerance of uncertainty. I've figured out that I have a very, I'm very intolerant of uncertainty. And so that's something we're going to be able to look at in our data. In our data, we've had parents reporting that they're grieving all sorts of things. They're grieving the really big losses, like obviously the loss of loved ones, but they're also grieving things like swimming lessons being canceled, or, dance classes for their kids. They're grieving a sense of structure, of stability, of normalcy. And I definitely can relate to what they're saying in our study for sure.
Amanda, how about for you?
Yeah, so I'm definitely noticing that I am grieving like human connection and touch. I'm a hugger, and so I just miss hugging people. So that's something I've noticed over time. Even though my kids won't stop touching me, I realize it's just this contrast of when I greet people and, I miss smiles, stuff like that. But in terms of our family life, I weirdly miss my kids' activities and sports. Like, you think, oh, we're so overscheduled and we're so busy. And I was realizing how much I was missing that for them. Like that is where they derive their competence and mastery, and and I have 3 boys who are super active. And so it's where they can release a lot of that physical energy. And when we were cooped up in the house for so long, like I just missed it for them. Cause I know it's such a productive and happy time for them. I missed our village a lot. I really missed quiet and alone time. Even as an extrovert, I found myself craving just any moments to be alone. So I was staying up really late at night just so I could have some quiet time in my home. Yeah, and so a lot of these things we're talking about are like safety and security, I missed being able to tell my kids, of course I'm going to keep you safe. Like I can't promise that in the middle of a pandemic. And that felt really hard to try to answer those questions. So these aren't the same losses we were talking about, right, that we typically grieve. And there was an article I recently read by Lauren Rockwell. Well, she called these ambiguous losses. And I thought that was a great characterization of it. And I think Victoria just linked to that article because she said, these are the kinds of losses that people don't show up with casseroles for. right? The kind that we're sheepish to admit. As somebody who complained all the time about driving my kids all over town for their activities, here I was complaining that I missed it. So those are some of the things I missed. And then just as a parallel to the, Lindsay's research and our study where we were following families over 4 months, what we found them reporting was that they mostly were grieving their loss of trust in other people to do the right thing. That was a huge theme coming up, that they just felt sad, that they didn't feel like they could even just trust neighbors, loved ones, friends, government, authority. So there was a loss of trust. They talked about grieving their routines, their normal way of life. Themes emerged around community connections, and the loss of childcare was a major theme that emerged. And then a lot of people talked about the inability to have funerals to honor deceased loved ones. So that was a really big theme that came up.
Yeah, there's a lot here. And so Dr. Blaustein, Margaret, I want to turn to you, right? How do children express grief, right? We're talking about grief kind of as adults here, but how do children express grief? And does it look different at all from how adults experience or express grief?
No, it's a great question. And I think, one of the things that's tricky for us as adults sometimes is we expect kids' emotions to look the same as our emotions as adults. And kids express themselves in all sorts of ways that are different. I mean, no two adults expresses in exactly the same way, right? Let's just acknowledge that. But for kids, there's this whole extra layer of things come out in behavior, and it comes out in their bodies. And, so for the little ones, we often get a lot of the somatic stuff, the tummy aches and the headaches. It gets held, the sadness, the grief, the anxiety gets held in their body. And, every parent of a little kid is used to someone, their child saying oh, I have such a bad tummy ache. And and it's because they're sad or they're worried about something that's about to happen. Younger kids, and through elementary school age, we can see some regression. So things that they had before, now maybe they don't have down so much, or they're needier, or things they're not quite as on top of anymore. And for all kids, their emotions can come out as other emotions. So you may have a kiddo who's feeling really sad and really upset, and it comes out as irritability and anger, or is easy frustration. I know something I saw a lot of in my own kids, and that I heard from a lot of other parents, is the need for control, all these tantrums that kids were having because they weren't in control of anything in their world anymore. And the only way to be in control is to say no to every single thing that a parent wants you to do. So a lot of that digging heels in. I think with teens, it can go a lot of different ways, right? You can see some of the more typical sadness and almost sort of what looks like depression when it lasts for so long. But also you may see some kids really isolate themselves and withdraw and sort of take space in a different way than maybe they previously did. I think for teens, they're really especially feeling that loss of social connection. And then other kids might start getting really clingy. You're like, why is my teenager suddenly wanting to talk to me all the time? I thought we were past this. So it can swing in different ways for teens and for young people.
I can definitely relate to a lot of that with my kids, especially the tantrums and the anger and irritability and that, and then you get to the bottom of it by talking to them and what they're really, they're sad about something, and eventually you get to that, but you have to go through all those layers first. So I have what might be kind of a silly question for people who study this and who specialize in this, but what about the kind of stages of grief model that you hear about in popular culture, denial first and bargaining and those sorts of stages? Is there anything to that, based looking at the research? Is there anything to people going through these stages of grief?
I think we've been seeing a lot of that in headlines, right? Just because people are grieving actual, deaths, losses right now, of course, in the middle of a pandemic, but I've been seeing these really interesting ways they've been applied to some of these other contexts. So, there is something to that. So that was what was created by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her very famous book on death and dying in 1969. She coined the 5 stages of grief, which were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But of course, since then, there have been a lot of criticisms about this model in that, you know, we don't necessarily move through the stages in that order in any sort of linear process. We may not go through all the stages, and that just looks different for different people. So I think that's where you sort of see some of the controversy or criticism around this model, that people, you know, tended to interpret it as like, I have to move through these in a certain way. But there are different components to that I think resonate with people differently. You know, as Margaret was saying, we all grieve differently. So David Kessler, who I mentioned earlier, actually introduced a 6th stage to that, which I think has been part of the more recent contemporary conversation around that model. And his 6th stage was called finding meaning. So I think that's an interesting new way also to think about how we use these grief experiences, and certainly, you know, for us, how we try to find meaning in the midst of our continued grief, perhaps. So yeah, so there's something to it, but we're still learning about it. But I'm sort of curious what Margaret thinks, though, about how those stages might look different for kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we all go through these stages and phases of grief. Kids in general, though, their emotion is so much less linear than adults' emotion is, right? And that can be really disconcerting for us as parents, because you know, maybe you're sitting in this sort of deep well of emotion and your kid's in a deep well of emotion, and suddenly your kid's like, can we have ice cream after dinner tonight? And it's like, wait a minute, where did that just come from? We're sad right now. We're feeling sad. And then 20 minutes later, as you're sort of calming from something, your kid is back in that deep well of emotion. And so, you know, it's actually very normative for kids to kind of dip their toes, you know, not in a purposeful way, but this is just sort of as they enter and exit into emotion, it comes in waves. And they may enter into and be feeling something really deeply, and then suddenly they shift. Right. And so there's a reason, you know, with young kids in particular, we often see really fragmented states. They look like this, and then they look like this, and then they look like this, and things can change real quickly. But it's also a way, I think, at all ages that we can titrate our experience, right? We know if we sit in really hard emotions for too long, it gets overwhelming. And so as adults, we may find ways to purposefully pull ourselves out of it. Kids just kind of disconnect from it. Right, and then they land back in it. So, you know, there's stages, but they look different in kids.
Yeah, and there's this way too that I'm hearing now talk about it, and I think, Margaret, you're giving this airtime where, like, kids don't really live in a verbal world. Like, their brains are still growing, like they're figuring out how to live in their bodies. And so when we look for emotion, or when we look for a grief reaction, we're looking to their own inner wisdom, like what are they holding in their body, or how are they making nonverbal sense of whatever the loss, whatever the grief is, right? So I want to kind of, you know, give some more context and ground us kind of in this moment with COVID-19, right? Because talk about grief. I mean, so much social loss and physical loss, right? So I guess I'm wondering, like, how do the specifics of COVID-19 make coping with grief perhaps a bit different from other kinds of traumatic events or natural disasters or man-made disasters that people might experience?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's always so hard, right? Because we try to think of like categories of experience and how these categories shape things, and it's so hard to compare one type of experience to another. But I think there are aspects to what we are going through right now as a society that, you know, I mean, at least in my lifetime, is qualitatively different than anything I've personally experienced before, than I think most of us have experienced before. And, you know, as I said to my kids, like, you're living through history right now, and no one necessarily asks to live through history, but this is a thing that's happening. I think one of the most marked things you just named is the impact on connection, on isolation. And, you know, it's a human drive, right? This is like built into our brains, that in times of danger, we seek, for the most part, for most of us, we seek connection, right? There's this attachment drive, and you think, you know, a baby falls down, they look for their parent, and it's something that we do over and over again in times of danger. And we're in this really challenging time where we're feeling this sense of stress and danger and anxiety, and at the same time, people feel dangerous. And so we want to connect and we want to be with people, and yet there's this huge inner conflict, right? And so that feeling of both wish for connection and for comfort and for safety from the people we love, you know, from our village, whatever that village is missing. And it's sort of overlaid with the sense that people are dangerous, right? And it's not just physical isolation right now. I think a lot of people are feeling isolated and disconnected, you know, emotionally and relationally from people who they've been connected with, because our experiences are different, right? We're all going through this really kind of different thing from each other. And so, you know, I sort of used to joke when this was all starting, everyone I knew was like talking on, you know, social media about what are we going to do with all of our time, and I'm doing puzzles and I'm catching up on all my Netflix shows. And I just wanted to strangle everyone. So I was like, I haven't had a free minute in 2 months. Like, I don't know where you're finding this time. And so there are so many things that are making people's experience different from people who they've felt connected to, right? And so there's both the physical isolation and the social isolation, but there's that like identity isolation that's happening right now.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting you bring up those extremes too of you know, people who are going through this where they can't get a minute to themselves, and that's a lot of parents. Like, you know, they've had no childcare for months and months. They cannot get a single minute on their own quiet time. And then other people who are just struggling because they're craving some sort of human or social connection, and they've had none of that. And I'm having this weird experience these 2 weeks because I had to go to the US last week, and now I'm in this 14-day quarantine that's required in Canada when you come back into Canada. And so I had these 14 days to myself, and I know any parent listening right now is going to be like, like, I'm so jealous of you. And I thought it was going to be this most amazing time. I mean, I love my children, of course, but I was really looking forward to this, and I've found it really difficult. And I have so much more empathy now for people who have been going through this completely on their own, because it's such a dramatic difference from what I was used to. But it is also very, very hard. So I keep thinking about this meme, and I sent it to Victoria because I wanted her to try to share it. But it's, you know, this, we're not all in the same boat. We're in the same storm, because, you know, you see a lot of these advertisements or, you know, we're all in this together type of signs. And I think people mean well, and we are all going through the same experience in some sense. It's the same pandemic, but, you know, some of us are in yachts and some of us are in canoes, and, you know, based on where we were before this started. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind, including when we're talking about grief.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So much of what you guys just said. I did not bake any bread. I didn't understand how everybody was either. Like, so I love that image of a boat you just said, Lindsay. Like, it makes me think about, you know, that yeah, we are all coming from different experiences. And then especially if we think about what's been happening over the summer, like understanding that the boats for marginalized groups, people of color, economically disadvantaged people, like look very different than the boat I'm trying to keep afloat. And so just sort of honoring that we all have these different experiences, which has been hard in lots of conversations we've all been having with parents around feeling like the sort of parent shaming about decisions we're making or not making, and just people, you know, we all need to have sort of grace and understand that the boats we're on look very different from one another. And so we may not always have that context. But so speaking of memes, it made me also just think about this other phenomenon, I think that's different. Like Gideon asked about how this pandemic is different. Our experience of grief might be different right now. And I think it's this notion, so you see Melissa McCarthy there, right? My friend Christina shared this with me at the same time she was telling me, like, hey, I think what you're experiencing is this anticipatory distress. Like, we just keep waiting for the next hit of 2020. And it was like spot on. Like, it just keeps being one thing after another. You know, some are really big, like our current, you know, sort of social and racial reckoning going on. Other things like murder hornets, you know, maybe didn't turn out to be what we were afraid of. But it's this, I guess I feel like for me, it's like this cumulative effect of constantly worrying about what's the next thing going to be. Like, it's just, here comes the next thing. And so, you know, this meme sort of put that in perspective for me of just, I am having this anticipatory distress of constantly waiting for the next shoe to drop. And it doesn't feel like that's going to let up anytime soon. And that's a different kind of grieving in this anticipatory way.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to, such one of these things that I think is happening, and you said it exactly there, you're waiting for the next thing to happen, right? How many times have you heard someone say like, oh, this is so 2020, right? Everything that happens, but because there is this felt compounding, of thing after thing after thing, of loss after loss after loss, and then we have other stressors on top of it, we stop experiencing the individual stresses as individual stresses, right? We feel each one, exponentially bigger. And the vigilance that means speaks to, I mean, that's a real thing. That's a trauma response, right? Because when our experience is of stress after stress after stress, one of the ways our brain protects us is to stay vigilant to the next thing coming down the road, right? And so, in evolution, that was helpful, but in the moment when we're just trying to get through our days and we're scanning for danger and like, what's going to happen next? Oh, there it is, right? It keeps us in this aroused state. And then the flip of that is because we're so tuned in to what's going to happen next that's stressful or hard, we miss some of the positive moments, right? We miss those moments along the way where we say, hey, today I had a really nice day, right? Like something nice happened, or my kid did something awesome, or I really enjoyed, I sat down for a meal, and it was whatever it is that happened that felt positive gets lost in some of that anticipation or that arousal or vigilance.
And then
so
that just makes me think like, and then we do that to our kids. Like I found myself doing that with, like you said, missing the positivity and joy. Like they've been able to go back to school, and I find and they overhear me saying like, well, this isn't going to last. And then I do those things that like take away the beautiful positive moments we're having because I'm worried about the next thing.
So let me offer this, kind of jump into brass tacks, right? As clinicians, as folks who, are well read and researchers on this topic. We're talking about loss, talking about grief, talking about just chronic like exposure to sort of long-term stress. I mean, it has an effect on our body and our brains, right? So Lindsay, I kind of want to look to you here, right? How can parents, teachers, caretakers, just other adults for kids, how can we help kids cope with grief, considering the loss of what we considered normal previously? How can we really come to assist and help kids cope with everything that's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think get comfortable with their grief.
Oh, it sounds like your audio is cutting out just a little bit.
I think the adults often want to try to fix everything. Oh no. Okay.
There you go. I think you're back. Yep.
Okay. All right. I'm hopeful. So sorry, I was saying that I think we have this instinct as parents to want to try to fix everything for our kids and, bubble wrap them and protect them from any kind of pain or harm or discomfort. And I definitely feel that myself. But when we remove those opportunities, or when we remove the pain and the discomfort and protect them from it too much, we remove opportunities for growth for them, for maybe building resilience. And so I think we have to get comfortable with the idea that they're going to have this grief and let, them sit with it and us sit with it as well. And not try to just fix it all the time. And I've had this exact conversation with my husband, where when I go to him with something, with a negative emotion or a problem, and it's like his first thing is to want to try to fix it. And I'm like, no, sometimes I just want to complain. Like I just want to vent about it, and I don't want you to try to do anything about it. So I think with our kids, it can look similar. And the last webinar we talked about how to talk to kids about COVID-19, but here it might look something like, I know it's really sad that you can't play hockey, or that your homecoming dance was canceled, or whatever it was. It's okay to be angry about that, or it's okay to be sad about that. It's so hard to not see your friends, and just acknowledge that and not try to say like, oh, it's not that big a deal, or it won't be like that forever. In a couple of years, you won't even remember this, those sorts of like dismissive things. So just getting comfortable with being able to sit with their emotions, which can be really hard. Yeah.
Yeah. It's such an important point, because, it's hard to sit with emotions sometimes, right? And it's especially hard with kids. And yet, you know, the first step for any of us is dealing with our emotions, is acknowledging that we have them, right? And, you know, it's true not just for our kids, but for ourselves as well, right? And I think it's really easy as parents to feel like you got to be on, you got to keep, you know, you can't take a break. And like lately, I mean, there is no break, you know, and it feels like you can't take a break because there's always so many things that have to be done, and we have to take breaks, right? You have to give yourself permission as a parent to like tap out and take your 5-minute, I love to think like the 5-minute vacation, right? Like I can't take an actual vacation right now, but I can like take 5 minutes if things are okay in the house, and I can, you know, do something silly. I can check social media. I was playing a game on my computer for the 5 minutes before I had to join this webinar tonight. So I'm like, this is the 5 minutes I'm getting today between taking care of my kids and finishing out my workday. I'm playing a silly game. You know, that's what I'm going to do. So really acknowledging our own feelings and doing the things we need to do to take care of ourselves so that we can continue to take care of our kids is just so important. And then finding that balance, right? So not just seeing our kids' grief and sadness and anxiety, but also seeing their joy and their positives and their happiness. And I think, Amanda, you alluded to that when you spoke about like the kids being happy about going back to school, like instead of us focusing just on the hard, to also see, you know, to see the mix so that they can also see and hold the mix.
Yeah, and I'll just offer, I think there's that layered piece where we're all experiencing this grief, and kids may be experiencing it one way, we may be experiencing it another way. So how do we fill our own cup before our little ones? It's complex. So I'll turn it to Amanda then, right? Because I think the piece here, right, there's an element of how do we recognize either for our kids or for ourselves when what is normal grieving may turn to depression or may turn to something more concerning. How do we recognize that?
Yeah, and I think that's what at least a lot of the parents we've been hearing from are really worried about, right? What is sort of normal right now? And then when should I really worry about my child's, you know, health right now or well-being? So a lot of the symptoms of grief overlap with symptoms of depression. Things like sadness, sleep problems, losing interest in eating or activities you used to enjoy, those that can be in both situations, those things present. The difference is mainly that symptoms of grief will lessen over time. But there will be things, you know, like Margaret was talking about, that cumulative effect. There will be things that get triggered again when there are reminders, like right now, you know, my dear friend's birthday coming up, an anniversary of her passing. Like all of these are reminders that are amplifying my grief about other things right now. So depression, though, tends to be more persistent and pervasive. And grief can sometimes trigger a depressive episode. So that's kind of why it gets a little confusing. But in most cases, grief will kind of, you know, decrease over time. So I've always liked this saying when it comes to grief that you don't necessarily get over it, but you get used to it. You learn to live with it. But if the severity of what your child or you are experiencing, if that doesn't seem to be decreasing as time passes, then it may be time to seek out some help. Talk with your doctor or your child's pediatrician, set up a time to have an initial conversation with a therapist or a counselor if you don't have one already. And interestingly, in some ways I've found in talking to a lot of families, like it's actually easier to do that stuff right now in our virtual world with telehealth visits than it might have been before when you had to drive an hour to get to the nearest counselor and, you know, something like that. So if you're really worried and you're seeing things not improving over time, then it may be time to kind of seek out some consultation around that, because it could start to be moving more into something like serious anxiety or depression or other symptoms. Again, either for you or for your child.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. There's a piece in there where, you know, Margaret, I want to kind of ask this of you, right? So how can caretakers, how can parents, you know, help prevent grieving turning into something more serious, right? So if we can identify the difference between the two, how do we prevent perhaps grief from turning into something like depression?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I was just thinking as you were talking, Amanda, about, you know, you spoke about how we sort of would anticipate that grief would start to come down over time. And one of the really tricky things about this experience we're in right now is the experience isn't ending, right? It's changing and it's shifting, but we're still in it. And so the things that trigger the grief, they change day to day and month to month, but they continue to hit kids over time. So it's even harder, right, to start to differentiate some of those things. In some ways, it's not even about like preventing, right? It's about addressing. It's addressing this all-consuming emotion that kids are experiencing and that we are experiencing as parents, and thinking, what are the things that we kind of need in our lives normatively and that often get lost when we're in this type of period. So things like, your daily routine. I love routines. I really like to know what's coming next in my day. And, that all got turned completely upside down back in March. And, it's true for all of us. And maybe it's like joke about routines that they're one of these things that like you don't notice when they're there, you notice when they're not there. And I remember right after this all started, people were posting all these, here's the schedule for the day, here's a sample schedule for your kids. I was like, that's just not happening. That's not happening in my house. But there is a rhythm, right, to our days. Like, and the rhythm's going to look different in every house. So sort of tuning in to what your rhythm is, because, I spoke earlier about that vigilance, about sort of when we're on guard and anticipating something happening. Part of what a routine does and what rhythm in our world does is it helps us lower some of that arousal down, so we're not as on edge all the time. And that can help kids sort of recalibrate their stress levels. Thinking about connection, like we've had to get really creative with it. And, I think in some ways, many of us tilted like full scale into like, we have to do 17 family Zooms a week to stay connected to people, and, early on, because we were all feeling that loss of connection. But we're recalibrating now, and connection looks different than it did before. But I've heard so many creative ways that people are approaching, having a virtual party. I mean, the number of really creative things that I saw people do with birthday parties over the pandemic was amazing. And so thinking about how we do it, not just during the special moments, but day to day, where there are opportunities for our kids to stay connected, for us to stay connected. Physical activity, Amanda, you spoke about your 3 active boys and how much they needed that outlet. That was one of the things for my kids. I have 2 kids who are very active. And, in normative times, they were getting PE and recess and 2 or 3 hours of after school activities and then sports. And like, they were just going all the time. And then suddenly they were sitting and doing nothing for like hours on end. And it came out, right? And the stress and the sadness and the isolation and just the sluggishness. And we had to really make a point of getting physical again. All these outlets for regulation, where and how can our kids be creative, and where are they able to express themselves through play, and where can they still explore their worlds and be curious about things. So thinking about all of those things and how to like balance those activities. And the last one I think is so critical, this idea of finding future-oriented goals, because there is such a risk when we're grieving and when we're looking at the losses, and when that starts to move to a place of helplessness, of losing sight of what might be a possibility. And so even really small goals help us to continue to see the future, right? Like, I'm going to work towards doing these 3 things, or what as a family can we work on? Can we clean up this one room, or can we build something, for ourselves, or whatever it is, but something that lets us keep an eye not just on the back, but the forward.
Yeah, can I have a question related to that, Margaret, that, I said that I've been struggling with like the lack of being able to plan and to make those long-term goals. And I talk a lot about my kids, to my kids about like, well, when the virus is over, or they'll say sometimes that we can do that when the virus is over. Or I'll remind them of things we used to do and places we used to go, in the before times, like, before the virus. And I'm just wondering, like, could that backfire? Should I kind of not be reminding them of their old lives and things that we used to do, or saying, hopefully eventually someday we'll do this again?
Yeah, it's such a tricky thing, I think, because there are so many things that we think hopefully we're going to do again, right? But I think in some ways part of, you spoke earlier, Amanda, in the stages of grief about that role of meaning making. And I think part of the meaning making when huge things happen is holding that the after almost never looks exactly like the before, right? And so I think for a lot of us in the beginning, I mean, for me at least, it was like, okay, well, school is closed for 2 weeks, so we're just going to get through these 2 weeks, and then we can just go back to normal. And then it was like, okay, well, it's going to be a month. Well, okay, maybe it'll be a couple of months. Well, darn it, this is going to last forever. And at a certain point, it became, if I keep holding my breath and waiting to go back to exactly what the before was, I never get to be in the now, right? And the now is different. And like, we're here. This is it. We're living in the now at this point. And, the best comparison I kind of have for myself in my life of this like huge event that shifted at least our national world here was what happened with 9/11. And things were different. Things were different afterwards. There were qualitatively different things that happened in our world in a very different way than what's happening now. But the after didn't look like the before, and yet the after just became a way of life, right? And I have nieces and nephews who were born after that, who have no memory of it happening, and this is just how life is. And I don't know what the now is. We don't know yet, right? It's changing. I think that what our world is now, and a month from now, and 6 months from now, is going to be an evolving picture, and sort of settling into the fact that it is okay to have our world transformed to some degree. It doesn't mean that everything from before is gone. It means that things are a little bit different than they used to be, and that we can be okay with that. Right, sort of allows us to step back into being and living and not just mourning. We can do both, right? We can mourn and we can be, and both are able to happen at the same time.
Yeah. So I want to offer one sort of final question here, and then we can move to the Q&A, because I recognize that like this is such a rich topic. We could spend we could purchase another hour together and just still not do it justice. But perhaps from a place of just sort of day to day, and like for me, one of the things that I kind of selfishly grieve is just not being able to go to my favorite coffee shop anymore, just because they're not open, and like my baristas whom I love are just not there. And it's such a little small thing that I think about. I'm like, this is probably not the thing to be worrying about, these days. But I guess I want to pose that to the three of you, whether it's that secondary shame around grieving and mourning the small things and those small losses, or even just minimizing, like, oh, the grief I have isn't as critical by comparison. I guess how would you respond to that sort of like inner dialogue that I know I'm not alone in holding? Like, what should we do with that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I have definitely felt that over the last few months, because it's expected that we'll grieve when someone dies. I mean, that is very clear, and we have a process for that. But for these smaller things, we don't really have a process, and we haven't really dealt with them before. And for me personally, I was supposed to be leaving right about now to spend the whole year in England for my sabbatical with the family, and my kids were going to get to live by their grandparents there for the first time since they were born. It was this very like once in a lifetime. They were going to develop adorable British accents and all of that good stuff. We're not doing that now. And I feel really guilty, feeling sad about that, because people are losing their lives and their jobs and their livelihood. And so how could I be sad about, and at the same time, we planned for that for years, and this has been this really important thing for family. And so, yeah, I don't have great answers for it. I can very much relate to it. And I think we have to give ourselves permission to grieve those things, but maybe some of the other clinicians here can even help me process that.
Yeah, I think it's been making me think about, like, I've had this conversation with so many of my college students and grad students too, and how quickly we're minimizing these, first world problems as people think about them that way. And like, we're not allowing ourselves to grieve them or talk about them. I see Victoria just put up a great example from a fantastic Instagram account that is all about parents right now, with great infographics. And so, she talks about there just some of these things we might be grieving, that it is okay to grieve those. And so I love the way you just said that, Margaret. I was writing it down as you said it. We can mourn and we can be. And I think that's similar here. Like, you can acknowledge your privilege and still honor your losses. Like Lindsay just did that, right? Like, I'm so sad I don't get to spend this year in England with my family. And I recognize people are losing their livelihoods and this can be worse, but both and. You can honor both of those things. And why I think that's so critical is because it's modeling for our kids to do that too. I talk to so many parents who are like, oh, my kid is so sad about prom, but recognizes like it could be so much worse. And it's like, no, let her feel that. This was something she's been looking forward to for years. It's a milestone. And so it's okay to keep perspective and honor the things you're really sad about, even if they feel small or like you should not be feeling that way. I don't know. What do you think, Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, you guys said it so well. I'm thinking about the image from earlier about, we're all potentially in the same storm, but not all in the same boat. And the awareness of that can make us really question our own emotions. And I was thinking, like, it's true, like, we're not all climbing the same mountain right now, and we're not all doing it with the same resources, but like, it's still hard to climb a mountain, even if you do it with all the tools and resources in the world. And I can like look over and see your mountain and be like, wow, that's a really big mountain, but man, I'm tired, And so just giving ourselves permission and space for our feelings. And I think what you just said is so critical, because it says to our kids, you can have the feelings you have, right? And it's, I, as a parent, sometimes like, I want to give my kids perspective, like, yeah, that's really hard, but listen, let me tell you about all these people in the world who are struggling with big things. But that doesn't, it helps broaden things, and sometimes that's part of our job as parents, is to broaden perspective. But it's also to hold that the emotions in that moment are real, and we need to do that for ourselves as well.
So I want to move us into responding to some of these, questions that are coming in. But before I do, a friendly reminder: be sure to fill out the very brief 1-minute feedback survey, because we want to be sure that these are responsive to folks' needs, and that we're like offering, critical information that y'all can take out there and use. But I want to offer this to the group, because I think, Margaret, you really landed us in a spot where how we hold space for others, or how we hold space for kids, is really critical. And so if we could start with you, I want to ask something that Claire had offered up, which is, how do I assume a parent, how do I as a parent cope with my grief of what my child is missing?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think it really highlights how we hold some of these losses in a way that's different from how our children hold them. And the fact that you're aware of that, I feel like it's like half the battle, right? Of knowing that your emotion and your child's emotion are different things. And so this is such a silly, small example, but like, my daughter was supposed to be in a dance performance, her first one ever, that she'd been working on and so excited about, and it was scheduled like a week and a half after the world shut down. And I was like, well, can't we just keep the auditorium open for like 2 more weeks just to get this? I was so upset. I don't even know why I was so upset about it. It was the silliest thing, but I was really mourning for her these months and months of rehearsals for this huge festival. She was over it a week later. Because her dance class started through Zoom, and she was so excited to see her friends again. And she said, oh, we'll do it next year, and we'll wear the same costumes. And, I think because I hold this longer frame of what we thought our children's path was going to look like, right, this year and next year and through the course of elementary school or high school or whatever stage your children are in, the losses hit us differently because we see what might have been. And for kids, especially younger kids, I think there is so much more of a focus on the now and the sort of immediate now. And so what they're feeling, you know, we're saying like, oh, what's it going to mean in the long term for my child to not connect to other people and to lose how to read facial? Is this going to forever change their understanding of connection? You know, we don't know yet, but probably not, right? There's so many ways that we address and attend to the developmental needs of our children. And so recognizing our grief for, you know, what our hopes and dreams were is different from the actual thing that our kids have lost, right? It's just giving ourselves space for that.
Yeah, and like related to that, recognizing for a lot of parents, some of what you're grieving might be that it was big milestones or lasts. And I think that's a part of it, is like Margaret was saying, you know, your kid might actually be doing okay with it, but you're struggling with it because it's like, no, this was my kid's graduation. Like, this is a moment for me too. Or I was supposed to move my kid into college, and this is the only chance I get to do that for their freshman year. And so it's around what it represents for you and your stage of life, and whether they're firsts or lasts or these milestones that you're grieving. So I think it's important, like you were saying, Margaret, to sort of separate out our stuff from their stuff. And so explore that with your child, see where they're at, but recognize that you may be grieving it much differently, or, you know, more severely maybe than they are. So it's good to process that, just maybe not with your kid if they're doing okay, you know, and seem to be all right.
So I know we got some time together, and we have maybe time for a couple more questions. And so I want to offer one that we've received, and I have a couple more, but particularly with respect to this particular topic of how we process our own grief, or how we could like help little ones process theirs. I guess I'm wondering if there are any like children's books about grief or loss that, as a panel, that you would recommend.
Well. In our conversations sort of leading up to this, I didn't know about these books called Trinka and Sam. And I've been reading, you know, when the pandemic first started, I was reading books to my kids, like there's a Berenstain Bears book about germs. There's Germs Are Not for Sharing. So I have, you know, little ones, 3 and 5. So that made sense just as it was starting, but now things have shifted, less focused on that. And Trinka and Sam books that I think Victoria can hopefully hear on Piplo Productions. You can download it. It's like a coloring book, and it's a great opportunity to have them do that activity and to talk about it. And there's even a YouTube link of a live reading of it. And then those are really good books. I don't know if people have any others.
Yeah, I mean, those are fabulous. I know one of the co-sponsors of the books, the Trinka and Sam books, is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and I know they have a whole section on grief in childhood on their website, and so that may be a really good resource if people are particularly looking for books at different ages and stages developmentally. Sometimes it helps older kids too to process through reading instead of through talking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and I was happy to see I was going to say just the Trinka and Sam ones, I think, are in at least 5 different languages, maybe more. So that was good to see too. Sorry, Amanda, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say, we're going to be linking to a number of these things in our resources section for this webinar, including quite a few things from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that Margaret referenced. That is not only books like this, but also just guides. Like, there's lots of great examples we'll post around how to talk to your kids about these things, you know, related to what traumatic grief is versus normal grief, like I talked about earlier. So you'll be able to find much more there too.
So I want to offer 2 more questions, and this second to last one, this first question is really for you, Margaret, because I know trauma is your area of expertise, and you, I mean, as our guest panelist, I think this is really right up your alley. So I want to offer this up to you. Carol shared, are there any tips for dealing with grief applicable to helping reduce hypersensitivity or hypervigilance as a result of an accumulated stress response? Or even, are there other strategies to help us cope with additional normal stresses in a more appropriate or balanced way, rather than what feels like a common experience, which is overwhelmed like nearly every day? So I'm going to offer that up to you and see where you take it.
Yeah. So, how much time do we have?
Yeah, that's right.
It's such a great hard question, right? To tune into the way that stress is held within us, and that it really takes a toll and has the potential to take a toll. I mean, a couple of things that are almost spoken to in the question itself. One is really tuning in ourselves, being aware of where we're at in our stress level on a given day, in a given moment. You know, it shifts moment to moment. And part of what happens for a lot of us is that things build up and we don't realize how stressed out we are until we're lashing out, or we're yelling, or we're so frustrated that we're crying. And so it shows up when it's here, instead of us preventatively trying to keep catching it here, right? And so if you think of it like this, like scale of stress, you don't want to first become aware of it when it's here, right? And stress gets held in your body, right? It's I mean, it's just a basic physiological thing. It's an arousal response, and it's protective, but it's also hurtful in some ways, right? It's protective because it's keeping you ready to deal with what's coming at you, but it keeps you in an aroused state that over time can be toxic to your body. And so the more we can do regular routine things, you know, we spoke about building rhythm in our days. I mean, things as simple as make sure that every hour, if you're on your computer all day like I am, give yourself a 5-minute break every hour and a half to get up and walk around and take a breath. I went out to walk my dog tonight, and I thought, I have not been out of this house all day long today. And I can feel it in my body, right? So thinking about where and how we can build in regulation techniques. Where can we take a deep breath? Where can we shift our brain from what it's doing? How can we sort of reframe for ourselves? So noticing where the stress is, and we spoke before about how we can tune into the hard. We want to make sure that we're also taking moments to purposefully tune in, whether it's at the end of the day or every hour, what felt good just now. It doesn't negate the bad. It doesn't negate the hard. You know, I think sometimes we worry that when we tune into the positive, we forget or minimize the hard. We're just balancing it a little bit. It's the quickest answer I can give to that one, but it's a great question.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, I have one last question from the Q&A, and then I have a closeout question, because I realize that this is such a rich topic. But I'll offer this to both you, Lindsay and Amanda. You know, I think about all of our healthcare providers who are working the front lines, and Laura offered a piece here. So Laura asks, where'd you go, Laura? There you are. Do you have any suggestions for dealing with the complexity of grief for healthcare workers who are working directly with COVID-19 and the impact that the work then has on families and kids? Considering grief, you then add anxiety to the mix, which seems to heighten grief, truly. Any feedback? Or
This is such a great question, Laura. Thank you for asking it. We've been thinking a lot about this. I think we're thinking about how we can, even in pandemic parenting, put out some more resources specifically for essential workers and healthcare workers. My brother's a pediatrician, so this hits my heart in lots of ways, because I have been watching how he has been struggling with this, along with many friends in the healthcare field, and what it is doing to families. And part of the reason for that is the grief. I'm assuming you're a healthcare worker, right? So the grief that you are experiencing and what you're seeing at work and how that is impacting you, layered with all these societal constraints around people sort of buying in, not buying in, believing it, not believing it, rallying behind you and calling you a hero. And a lot of healthcare workers really struggling with that, saying, I don't want to be a hero, just give me what I need to do my job and let me do my job. And so there's frustration and complexity to all the things that are being thrown at you right now. And then you're supposed to come home, right? And be this joyful, engaged parent that is really attuned to what your child needs in those very few coveted moments that you get with them right now. So I don't know that I have a great answer, because it's something for us to keep thinking about, other than to say, or emphasize, I guess, all the things we've been talking about, attending to your experience right now and how to help yourself. You know, sort of like Gideon said, fill your bucket, put your mask on first. Like, you cannot be there in the ways that you want to if you yourself are pretty traumatized right now and not able to sort of own and name some of the things you're feeling and experiencing. And so I know that's a lot easier said than done, right? I can imagine what my brother would say, which is like, when do I have time to attend to my mental health amidst everything else I have to be doing right now and being there for my family? So I think, but attending to that and recognizing like, this is something going on for me and I'm going to keep working at it, and being honest with your kids about that. I'm going to do my best to keep showing up for you in all the ways that you need me to. But sometimes it's really hard for mommy because I had a rough day, just like you sometimes have rough days. And so I think being able to have that conversation is also great modeling for your kids. So I know that was a little all over the place, but I just know that it's something we know we need to be attending to a lot in the work that we're doing in pandemic parenting, because we have heard from so many of you craving some of this, these resources. So thank you.
All right, final question that I hope y'all, I mean, even as you are engaging with this, that you spend some time responding to, but for our panelists here, where we land this conversation, hopefully is in a place of growth. What are some positives, if any, to emerge from all of this loss for each of you?
Well, first, Laura's comment in the chat I saw come up that you were right, Amanda, that she is, and she's working with COVID patients. And so I just want to say thank you for everything that you're doing, and we really appreciate everybody who's on the front lines of this. In terms of positive things, this is kind of a small one that was also huge for me that I didn't expect to be huge, but being home with my kids the last few months, my son had turned 5 in May. And so over the summer, I got to see him learn how to read right in front of my eyes. And it was not something I expected to be so emotional about or so excited about. But I grew up, reading books and sneaking places to bed and like reading, and he's not quite there yet. It's still a chore, but he's doing it, and I got to see it unfold, and I wouldn't have been able to see that before. So just little things.
Sounds like your audio is cutting out, but you would maybe conclude it.
Yes.
You're good.
Yeah.
Amanda, how about for you?
Yeah. I guess there are lots of positive moments, and I'm so glad you asked this, Gideon, because it's important for us to attend to those. So for me, I think the increase in like empathy and perspective. So I've been able to have some amazing conversations with my kids about what it means to sacrifice for the greater good, that, we wear masks to keep other people safe. And so, how they've had glimpses also in this process of like not having access to things we might usually have access to in our sort of Amazon one click away generation of kids, right? That like what it means to make do in situations. So it's been giving some good fodder for conversation in our home. There's this constant dance in our family dynamic, right, of meeting each person's needs, needing to ask for kind of grace and patience, and learning how to do that, because we're not always going to be on the same emotional wavelength at the same time. So that's been great. My husband travels for his job and is gone most weekdays. And so having their dad home, it's been 6 months of us getting to have him home nonstop, and they haven't had that in years. And while that may have been a harder adjustment for me having him home so much, it's actually been, I think, this time that we'll look back on and be really grateful for, because of what our family dynamic usually is. And then I think there's just this like visual for me of these beautiful moments of creativity and connection when we've had to be locked down, hunkered down. So forts stick out in my mind. Like they have made so many forts, and we have hidden forts, and we've watched movies in forts. And so I just think that's so representative of like the beauty and the messiness in this period, because my house is a mess all the time with these forts, but we're hunkered down together. And that is, I hope, something we look back on pretty positively.
I love that. And I'm just laughing because we've sort of resigned ourselves in my house to being messy. My daughter says it to me, we're just messy people, Mom. So you're right, we're just messy people. It's okay. I think for me, it's so many of the same things that Lindsay and Amanda mentioned. I mean, this opportunity to be together in a way that, is draining and exhausting at times, of course. but is just so different than what we've ever had. And I remember in the beginning thinking, how am I ever going to get through 2 weeks of having my kids at home and no childcare and no going out the door? And we've gotten through almost 6 months of it now. And we've managed, and they have gone from being kids who need to be entertained to kids who figured out how to entertain themselves. And, you know, those first few months, especially when we were really in a very tight bubble, watching my kids spend time with each other and get really creative with that. And, you know, Amanda, you talk about your image as the fort. For me, it's this image of my kids walking up the street holding hands, and something that they haven't done as much of because they've hit the age where they just annoy each other. But now they've had to be each other's playmates, and it's been lovely a decent amount of the time. So getting to see that. And, you know, I'll say for me, one of the big sort of forced ones was really pushing myself to say no sometimes and to have balance and boundaries in my life, because I haven't had a choice, right? You know, I'm a parent and I have kids and I'm working and I'm doing all of these things, and at some point you just can't do it all. You have to say, like, it's okay for me to do this much and not this much. And I've had the luxury and privilege of being able to do that, but the payoff on the other side of saying, wow, I can balance that. I can say I've got to carve out 3 hours of my morning so I can help my kids get through the school day and then do all my work in the afternoons and figure out how to do that. And it's okay for me to say to people, I can't do morning meetings anymore. Right. And so really seeing sort of how that internal experience of being able to shift things and still be okay is really nice.
So we will move to close here. But first, I just want to pull everyone's attention to the chat box where we have just a couple of links for you to check out and consider. But of course, first and foremost, a big thank you to Dr. Margaret Blaustein for joining us this evening for this really important conversation. With that, I will step back as your moderator and hand this over to Amanda for some closing remarks.
Thank you. And thank you, Gideon, for doing a fantastic job reining in this crew tonight and keeping us on track. I appreciate it. So again, thank you to everybody for joining us. We'll be posting the recording and a bunch of resources, including reflection questions that we encourage you to take and use in your circles. Talk with your other friends, family, use it as a way to kind of process what's going on for all of you. And just a reminder that if you learned anything tonight, if you find these helpful, we really appreciate the support. Remember that all donations and proceeds from this next week will go to the Mariana Baserga Moving Barriers Fund to make college more accessible to youth. And so with that, again, thank you to Gideon, Margaret, Victoria, my partner, Lindsay. Our next Pandemic Parenting Exchange will be on Thursday, September 17th, again at 9 p.m. Eastern, where we will be talking about mom guilt and good enough pandemic parenting. And we'll be joined for that one by psychologist and author, Dr. Sharon Lamb, author of the book, The Not Good Enough Mother. And so if you've ever felt mom guilt or like you weren't good enough, we're going to be tackling all of that. So we hope you'll join us. In the meantime, check out the website, follow our various social media accounts where we'll be posting resources, including some answers to some of the great questions that came in that we did not have a chance to respond to tonight. So thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next time, and take good care.